Hello everyone, welcome to Positron Academy. And today's topic of discussion is on the history of nuclear medicine. As well said by Bernard Cohen, that science taught without a sense of history is robbed. And that is why today we are trying to understand the history of nuclear medicine to understand science in a much better way. So that's the outline of this presentation, and we will start with understanding the discovery of radiation and radioactivity, followed by discovery of neutron, followed by discovery of artificial radioactivity, and so on and so forth. In 1895, a man took a picture of a hand, and this hand picture was so mind-boggling that he won a Nobel Prize, and it changed the world. And his name is Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen. And that's the first medical image ever taken. May not be very impressive today, but at that time when it was taken was mind-boggling, because it was for the first time we can look inside the human body without having to slice someone open. And indeed, medical imaging has changed the face of medicine today. But now the question is how this image was being taken. So on November 8, 1895, Röntgen was studying the light emission generated by electrical discharge in an evacuated glass Hittorf-Crooks tube that he was using to investigate the cathode rays. So he blocked the tube with paper and the room was dark, but he noticed that the screen across the room was glowing. And when he blocked the beam with his hand, he could see the bones in his hand projected on the screen, and he was very amused. What led to the projection of the bones of his hand on the screen? What type of rays was being emitted from that particular cathode ray tube? And he spent several weeks studying the new rays emitted from it. So on December 28, 1895, Röntgen published a report on a local physics committee entitled as On a New Kind of Rays, and during this committee he presented a 30-minute exposure of his wife hand on a photographic plate, and that's the first medical image ever taken, and that's the hand picture of Röntgen's wife. And now we can see how beautiful the image looks like. The contrast between bone, soft tissue and the metal is so clearly visible. May not be the quality is very better, but still whatever we can see in this image is so well appreciated. So by 1896, X-rays were becoming an established tool in medicine, and in 1901 Röntgen was awarded Nobel Prize in Physics. So that's the geographical map of Germany, and that's where Röntgen lived at Würzburg, and that's in Paris where Becquerel actually lived. So after learning of Röntgen's discovery of X-ray, Becquerel chose to study the mysterious rays created when he exposed the salt named as potassium uranyl sulfate dihydrate to sunlight and placed it on a photographic plate wrapped in black paper. And that's the impression of which the photographic plate showed of the uranium crystals. So he believed that the sun's energy was being absorbed by the uranium, which resulted in the emission of the X-rays. But later he discarded this belief which he had. So one day these uranium covered plates were returned to a drawer, and although Becquerel expected only faint image because there was no possibility of sunlight in that drawer. So, but when he opened the drawer and he saw, the image remained strong and clear. So that's not related to sunlight, that's something inherent to the uranium itself that lead to the emission of these radiations. Later he demonstrated that radiations emitted by uranium, it shared certain characteristics with the X-rays. But unlike X-rays, these radiation could be deflected by magnetic field. So whatever radiations were being emitted from this uranium, so these radiations were deflected by the magnetic field, indicating that whatever was being emitted by that was charged particle. Unlike X-rays, these were not deflected by the magnetic field, indicating these were not charged particles, but whatever was released from uranium, these were charged particle as it was deflected by a magnetic field. So now let us see the timeline over here. So in 1895, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen discovered the X-rays, and that's the first medical image ever taken. In 1896, Henry Becquerel discovered radioactivity. Now it's time for Marie Curie. Let us have a brief understanding about the contribution, about the roles, about what Marie Curie has done in her tenure. So that's Marie Curie. The name is sufficient, and her contribution to the world of physics, nuclear physics, oncology is way mind blowing. We cannot ignore her name whenever we will talk about radiations, radioactivity. So we have to take her name. So in 1897, Marie Curie was looking for a topic for her doctoral thesis research, and she was fascinated by the work of Becquerel and decided to systematically investigate the uranium rays using an electrometer based on the piezoelectric effect. And Marie Curie discovered that thorium emits the same rays as uranium, as said by Becquerel. So she discovered that she discovered that thorium emitted the same rays as uranium, but the strength of the radiation did not depend on the chemical composition. It depends on the amount of uranium or thorium in the sample. It means that higher the amount of uranium or higher the amount of thorium, higher will be the radioactivity. It was linked more on the amount rather on the chemical composition. And she concluded that the radiation did not depend on how the atoms are arranged in the molecule, but rather it was linked interior to the atoms. Now we can understand how visionary she was. She actually told it much before neutrons were discovered. Now we know that neutrons and the n by z ratio, how they regulate the radioactivity or the nuclear stability trend, and she concluded it much way back that the radiation, it depends on the interior of the atom themselves, but not on the arrangement of the atoms in the molecule. And that was a very revolutionary finding that actually changed the field of physics. And later on, she decided to work on a very radioactive ore named as pitch blende, and she found that the pitch blende has 4 to 5 times the amount of radioactivity that was expected based on the amount of uranium. So as the radioactivity was 4 to 5 times higher, so this ore must contain some other elements because of which she could get this higher radioactivity. So in addition to the uranium, she discovered 2 more elements, polonium and radium. Polonium because she was from Poland, and radium because that was so much radiative in nature. So the unit of radioactivity, what we call as Curie, is equivalent to the activity of 1 gram of radium, and this was named in Madame Curie's honor. So that's Marie Curie in her lab in 1905, and that's Marie Curie with her husband Pierre Curie at the lab at Sorbonne, and in 1903, Pierre Curie and Henry Becquerel were nominated for Nobel Prize in Physics, but Marie Curie was being overlooked. But Pierre Curie take a stand of his wife, and then both the Curies and Becquerel won the Nobel Prize in Physics, and Marie Curie being the first lady Nobel laureate. So that's the first Nobel Prize received by Marie Curie in physics in 1903, and later again in 1911, Marie Curie was again awarded Nobel Prize in recognition of her services to the advancement of chemistry by discovery of the elements radium and polonium, and also by isolation of radium and the study of the nature of and compounds of this remarkable element. And she became the first person, male or female, to be awarded 2 Nobel Prizes. So Marie Curie's contribution to physics, chemistry, nuclear physics, and the mind-boggling discoveries and treatment opportunities in oncology is mind-boggling. It's really fascinating work done by Marie Curie, and that's some motivational quotes by Marie Curie is that nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Now is it time to understand more and that we may fear less. The more you understand, the less you fear. And that's one of the greatest quotation by Marie Curie that knowledge leaves no regrets except for radiation. I wish I would never messed with that. So as because whatever achievements we have or whatever path-breaking research Marie Curie did, and because of which whatever radiation physics or whatever nuclear medicine which we see, these are all because of the path-breaking research laid down by Marie Curie. But as a result of this, all this experimentation laid down by Marie Curie and her family, so she was being exposed to a high radiation dose from those radioactive sources, and she developed a bone marrow disease, and later on she died. That's why she says that knowledge leaves no regrets except for radiation, explaining the lethality of radiation on the body. And that's the cemetery plot for the Curie family, and the coffin which she was being placed, it was lead line because her body was so radiative. So let us have a brief understanding of how the neutron was discovered. So in 1930, Walther Bothe and Baker bombarded beryllium, boron, fluorine, and lithium with alpha particles, and these alpha particles were emitted from polonium. And it showed that after bombarding this group of elements with alpha particle, it resulted in the emission of highly penetrating radiation. And these reactions was again been investigated by Marie Curie's daughter and her son-in-law, and they postulated that the radiation produced in this reaction was high energy gamma ray photon. And again, these reactions were again investigated by James Chadwick at the Cavendish lab in Cambridge, and and based on what he experimented with these reactions, so based on that he published an paper on Nature on Feb 27, 1932, entitled as Possible Existence of Neutron. So what it means basically that whatever radiations was being coming out when alpha particles were being bombarded to the elements beryllium, boron, lithium, or whatever it be, it results in the emission of neutron. So he told about that there is certain possibility that there is something we call as neutron, and that's James Chadwick who told that it can be a neutron. And that's the experimental setup which they had. We had a source of polonium which is sending off alpha particles, and it emits a radiation of great penetrating power when it hits a foil of beryllium. So something happened over here, something happened and something comes streaming out of that could not be explained based on the current theories. And also they noticed that when they placed a piece of hydrogen in the form of paraffin wax, it results in the increased amount of ionization as measured by the ionization chamber and oscillograph. And based on that, and based on what assumption they had, or based on what estimation they had, they told if this unknown radiation has to be gamma ray photon as said by Irene Curie and her husband, so the energy of the gamma ray photon has to be approximately 50 mega electron volt for the amount of ionization they saw over here. And if the energy of the photon is less than that, this cannot be possible. And that's the first hypothesis they had for the explanation of the same, and that is what we call as quantum hypothesis. That is, the capture of alpha particle by beryllium nucleus results in production of C13 and gamma rays, and that's the gamma ray which was being emitted, which is being emitted from here. But that's very difficult to explain on the assumption that radiation from beryllium is a quantum radiation if we are trying to conserve energy and momentum. And based on the calculation which they had done, so the energy of the quantum over here cannot be greater than 14 mega electron volt. And based on the ionization which you saw, by 14 MeV of gamma ray, that amount of ionization is not possible. So we cannot be in accordance with quantum hypothesis that this cannot be a gamma ray responsible for this amount of ionization that we saw. So if we ascribe the ejection of proton in the process, like the capture of alpha particle by beryllium-9 results in emission of protons, then this proton must have a defined range in air. So what they have done, they placed an aluminum foil in between the paraffin wax and the ionization chamber, and the aluminum foil has defined thickness. So based on that, they calculated the range of the proton. So it has to be range somewhat like over here in about these range in air, but the range they have obtained is about 3 millimeter. That's 3 times of the range which they actually expected. So that's very sure that that's not a proton but something else that has got more penetrating power, because as these adds, because if it has to be proton, then this proton will interact with this aluminum foil because that's a charged particle, so it will interact and lose energy. So obviously the range will be lower, but as the range they obtain is quite higher, that make it very clear that's not a proton but something that has got more penetrating power. And that's the neutron hypothesis, as said by Chadwick, that the capture of alpha particle by beryllium-9 nucleus results in emission of C12 along with neutron, and which the quantum hypothesis says that capture of alpha particle by beryllium-9 results in C13 and a gamma ray, but it's not C13 but it has to be C12 along with emission of a neutron. So, and from the energy relations of this process, the velocity of the neutron emitted in the forward direction will be about 3 into 10 to the power 9 centimeter per second. And the collision of this neutron with the other atoms through which it passes give rise to recoil atoms. And the observed energies of the recoil atom are in fair agreement with this view, like it's in accordance with law of conservation of energy and momentum. So that's now we are very clear now, that's nothing but that's not gamma radiation, not proton, but these are neutrons which are being emitted from this beryllium-9 nucleus. And we all know that how great neutron multiplier beryllium is. So you give one neutron, it gives you 2 neutrons back. So that's how beryllium actually works. It is a neutron multiplier. That's not the course of understanding. So now we know that that's neutron which is being emitted from this beryllium nucleus, and that's not gamma radiation, not proton, and that's the main reason why it has higher range, as because neutrons are neutrally charged, they don't have any charge as such, so it does not interact with the aluminum foil, and that's why it has got higher range. Whereas protons, it interacts with the foil and lose energy, and thus the range is quite lesser. So that's how the neutron was being discovered, and these actually opened the door for understanding the atomic structure, and also lead the door for the reactor science and lead to the advancement of the radionuclide production, and that's the achievement of James Chadwick. So the next is about the discovery of artificial radioactivity. So in 1934, following the footsteps of Pierre and Marie Curie, Irene and her husband created radioactive elements by irradiating stable nuclides with alpha particles. So what they have done, they have bombarded a series of elements like hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, boron, carbon, and these elements with alpha particles. And out of all these bombardations, only 3 produced artificial radioactivity. Example being aluminium, when bombarded by helium, results in production of P30 and emission of a neutron. And this P30 itself is so unstable, it decays to silicon by emission of a positron. And because of this great discovery, Irene and Frederick Joliot-Curie won Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1935 in recognition of their synthesis of new radioactive tracer. And these discovery laid the foundation for the modern day nuclear medicine and the radiopharmaceutical chemistry, because all the radionuclides which we use for nuclear medicine are all artificially produced. For example, F-18, these are being produced artificially in cyclotron. So, Irene and Frederick Joliot-Curie were very close, making 2 great discoveries, like for discovery of positron and neutron. But because of their misinterpretation, they were very close to it. So, but they could not make it out. But still, they got Nobel Prize. So the next is on the cyclotron era. So Ernst Lawrence developed the first cyclotron at the University of California at Berkeley. Interestingly, Lawrence was also producing artificial radioactivity like what Irene Curie did. but he failed to notice these residual emission because the same switch that operated the cyclotron also operated the Geiger counter in the lab, and that's why he failed to notice the residual emission. And these Wadkoff-Lorentz team, along with the Wadkoff-Joliot-Curies in the early 1930s, led to the discovery of iodine-131 by Glenn Seaborg and John Livingood, and technetium by these people in 1938 at Berkeley, and set the stage for the use of cyclotron for the production of radionuclides for PET and SPECT. That's a great milestone achieved by this group of people. And that's Ernst Lawrence with his developed cyclotron, and that's the image of patent as filed by E.O. Lawrence. And that's the greatest news that he had, that he has won the Nobel Prize. So Ernst Lawrence has the Nobel Prize, Nobel laureate, and Champagne Party, November 17. And because of this greatest development of the cyclotron, he was being awarded Nobel Prize in physics. So that's the greatest quotation which I can tell you about. Instead of an attic with a few test tube bits of wire and odds and ends, the attack on atomic nuclei was not simple. The attack on the atomic nuclei has required the development and construction of a great instrument on an engineering scale. So it might look very simple, but attacking on the simplest atom was not simple. Attacking on the atomic nuclei has required the development and construction of a great instrument on an engineering scale. So the next part of discussion today is on the tracer principle. So what is all about the tracer principle? So the use of radioactive compounds to measure in vivo process is what we call as the tracer principle. So the tracer principle, which forms the basis of nuclear imaging, is the following. So what we do is that a radioactive biologically active substance is chosen in such a way that its spatial and temporal distribution in the body reflects a particular body function or metabolism. So in order to study the distribution without disturbing the body function, only traces of the substance are administered to the body of the patient, and that's why we call as tracer, because only traces of the molecule are being administered. And these studies were being first done in experiment, and they used bismuth 210 to follow the circulation of bismuth containing antisyphitic drugs in rabbits. And because of this greatest work, George D. Hevesy was being awarded Nobel Prize and being called as the father of nuclear medicine. So, and this award was being given to George D. Hevesy and the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1943 for his work on the use of isotopes as tracer in the study of chemical process. And that's some of the work done by George Hevesy, and that's on the absorption and translocation of lead by plants. And that's the initial studies on the velocity of blood flow using the radio tracers. And now moving forward to the discovery and the use of radionuclides of iodine. The effect of iodine on the thyroid were first studied only a few years after the discovery of iodine in seaweed. And in the initial days, iodine was used to treat goiter. And the MGH thyroid clinic established by J. Howard Means began using stable iodine to treat hyperthyroid patients. And in 1936, Saul Hertz, a member of the MGH thyroid clinic, who later became the director of the same, asked a colloquium at Harvard Medical School whether iodine can be made radioactive or not. So the outcome of was a cooperative program between MGH and the MIT, which focused on producing iodine-128 using a neutron source and studying its uptake and rapids. But the main issue was that iodine-125 has a smaller half-life of about 25 minutes. Now the next question was whether a long-lived isotope of iodine can be produced or not. And to that question, answer was from J.J. Livingood, that he published an article on the Physical Review named as Radioactive Isotope of Iodine, in which he mentioned about 5 radioactive iodine isotopes, and 3 of which are all new. So these were produced by using 8 MeV deuterons, 16 MeV helium ions, and neutrons. And these are this group of isotope that are being prepared from the same iodine-128, iodine-126, iodine-124, iodine-130, iodine-131, and again 130. So out of these, the interest of us in of interest of our is in iodine 130, which has a half life of 8 days, and which was produced by bombarding tellurium 128 or 130 by deuterons, and lead to the production of iodine 129 or iodine 130. So 131. So that's about the initial discoveries of iodine 31 through this process. And although the initial studies with the radionuclides of iodine focused on treating hyperthyroid cases, hyperthyroid diseases. So the initial studies were based on the treating hyperthyroid diseases, but a few different groups in New York were investigating treating thyroid cancer also with iodine 130. And what they found is that is very important, that the abolition of thyroid, which reduced thyroid competition for uptake of iodine, was very important for treatment of metastasis. And that's one of the initial studies on the treatment of thyroid carcinoma with radioactive iodine 131. And because of these great innovations and the initial seminal studies, it changed the thyroid cancer from being a death sentence to a disease with an overall survival rate of 85%. Now we can see how questioning is very important, that like from the initial time we have been using a normal iodine for treating goiter, then we asked about whether asked about radioactive iodine, then we asked about longer lived iodine, and then we got to know about iodine 131, and then studies and studies and studies, and then we got to know about treatment of thyroid carcinoma about with radioactive iodine. So those studies are very important, and apart from this, what is more important is about asking question on the prevailing situation is also very important. So that's Glenn Seaborg and John Devincourt with their manuscript for the production of iodine 131. And now moving forward to the early studies with radionuclides of carbon. So in the late 1930s, Ernst Lawrence lab at Berkeley was producing carbon 11. And this carbon 11 has a very shorter half time of 20 minutes. So it was being made by bombarding boron oxide with deuterons. And this group of people used carbon 11 to study metabolism of carbohydrates, and that's the initial paper published by some other people on preparation of glucose labeled with C11. But now let's see how beautifully they have produced C11 labeled glucose. And they used radioactive CO2, radioactive C11 CO2 gas, and they gave it to the starved Swiss chard leaves. And through photosynthesis and through this process, they produced pure C11 level glucose. That's the creativity we can understand by using plant as a generator for production of glucose. So that's the creativity of these people. So today we are using chemistry modules for production of FDG, but at that time they are using plants to produce C11 glucose. And with this glucose they studied multiple things, but the C11's glucose 20-minute half-life means that the investigations at Berkeley were somewhat limited because it has a very short half-life. So in Feb 1940, Kamen prepared a graphite target and bombarded with it this configuration of deuterons on this configuration of cyclotron at Berkeley, and what they got is C14. And that's the initial paper published by Martin D. Kamen for the early history of C14. And this discovery of C14 is considered a very seminal moment in radiochemistry because due to its importance in importance of carbon in the life sciences, like C14 dating, what we do today these days is all based on C14, and that's the milestone achieved by Kamen and Rubin for discovering C14, and that's Samuel Rubin and Martin Kamen who discovered C14. Now moving forward to the post-World War II nuclear medicine, so development of atomic bomb and its use in destroying Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II resulted in foundation of the Atomic Energy Commission in 1946 to promote peaceful use of nuclear chemistry and radiochemistry. So, and part of the mission of this AEC was to use the radionuclides and part of this mission of this AEC was to advance the use of radionuclides for use in nuclear medicine imaging and therapy. And in 1946, it was announced that the fission produced radionuclides, including iodine-131, was immediately available from the Manhattan Project at Oak Ridge. And these funding from this Atomic Energy Commission actually fueled several seminal discoveries in nuclear medicine and molecular imaging, including development of gamma scintigraphy cameras, SPECT cameras, PET cameras, and the MOLI generators are just few names. And these AEC funded several milestone projects, which has led to today's nuclear medicine. Now moving forward to technetium generators and technetium level pharmaceuticals, that's how technetium came into picture by Perrier and Segre showed that by bombarding neutron or deuteron or to molybdenum it can lead to production of technetium. So but these was not clear because the nuclear isomeric states were not well understood at that time, and which held up the publication of the work. But its discovery was later collaborated when it was isolated from fission products, though it would take another 20 years before the medical potential of technetium was being realized. So one of the most important things about technetium is about the properties which it has, including its half-life, including its energy of photon 140 kilo electron volt, its lack of particle emission, and its rich chemistry. It makes it ideal for imaging the in vivo functions of at the molecular level. And as a result of its great properties, the use of technetium was strongly promoted by Powell Richards. And remarkably, a patent was also filed for the medical use of technetium, but it was rejected because it was felt at the time that the use of radionuclide would never expand beyond research applications. But it all changed when Beck pointed out the optimum detection energy for sodium iodide crystals was 150 kilo electron volt, and that's from here that for the good tumor contrast as a function of gamma energy indicates that under typical conditions, gamma rays in the energy range of 100 to 200 keV are optimum for detecting midline tumors, and it changed the whole new world. And that's Walter and Powell Richards, and that's the first MOLI generator created in 1958 by this group of people. And now moving forward to development of imaging instrumentation. So in addition to the creation of radionuclides, because now whatever we have seen, we have created radionuclides, but development of radionuclides is incomplete without the development of imaging instrument, because that will give you how your pharmaceutical has distributed inside the body. So the development of imaging instruments was very critical for the expansion of nuclear medicine. And the initial detection was performed using GM counter, and that were moved manually over the target of interest to measure the uptake of radionuclide. And one of the initial evaluations was to measure the rate of iodine uptake and in the thyroid gland, and to assess if the nodule was benign or malignant. And in 1960, Benedict Chazen started evaluating metallic crystals as scintillators that could enhance sensitivity by switching out the detectors in GM counters to calcium tungstate to facilitate the enhanced detection of iodine, and development which led to the development of scintillator counter. Later, he switched to thallium doped sodium iodide crystals, added PMTs, and automated a system to scan our thyroid to produce an image. And that's the scintillation detector was quickly expanded to take nuclear medicine images of other organs as well. So that's how the development of imaging instrument took place, from GM counter to scintillation detector, from calcium tungstate to sodium iodide crystals, added to PMTs, and also automation of the same to take image of other organs as well. So that's how things changed with time. So the next advancement come with the development of rectilinear scanner, which automated the positioning of the scanner and became the standard instrument used for nuclear imaging from 1950s to 1970s. But the main limitation which this technology had is about the time it consumed. And a breakthrough came when Hall-Anger invention of gamma camera that incorporated collimation to view the entire organ of interest at one time and added an array of photomultiplier tubes to improve detection efficiency. And that's Hall-Anger and Benedict Chazen in the annual meeting of Society of Nuclear Medicine. And in 1953, a multi-detector instrument for the localization of brain tumors with PET radionuclides were developed by Brownell and Sweet. And in 1966 at Brookhaven National Lab, they developed the first circular array of detectors for imaging the brain, named as head shrinker or hair dryer due to its shape, and that's the first multi-detector instrument for localization of brain tumors. As we can see over here, that's the possibility of a brain tumor over here, and that's the circular array of detectors used for brain imaging, also being called as head shrinker or hair dryer because of its shape. So in 1960s, David Cull and Roy Edwards developed a nuclear medicine tomographic imaging device and introduced the concept of longitudinal and transaxial tomography. And this was announced by Hounsfield when he developed the transverse axial tomography for radiography, which aided the development of PET. And that's the first PET instrument that employed the filter back projection, and that's how it looks like, and that's Henry Wagner inside the early PET scanners at Washington University. So now let us talk on the discovery and application of F18 FDG. So if you look at the structure of glucose and FDG, both of the structure looks very similar. But the main difference lies at the second carbon position, in which you can see in glucose there is an hydroxyl group, but in FDG there is an F18, and this F18 is in positron emitter and decays by positron emission. And these FDG is being used to study glucose metabolism in human beings. So the fact that removal of these hydroxyl group on the second carbon position prevents the hexokinase reaction was noted in 1944 by these two group of people, Sols and Crane. And based on this idea, these two people, Louis and Martin, developed a method to produce C14 labeled 2-deoxyglucose and measure its metabolism in rodents. But C14, as you know, it's a very large half-time of 5700 years. So it cannot be used in human because of its long half-life and its inability to image the distribution of the radioactivity. A search for an alternative of tracer started ensuing. And finally, the idea to use a positron-emitting radionuclide was developed by scientists at University of Pennsylvania, who took the problem to Alfred Wolf at Brookhaven National Lab, where it was discussed in 1973 and in a meeting entitled Discussion of Programs of Mutual Interest with Emphasis on Labeled Carbohydrates for Brain Function Imaging, Brain Function Studies. And eventually he came out with a great idea and to produce 18F labeled variant of glucose, and that's the process by which he produced F18 FDG. That's bombarding neon with deuterons and getting F18, and this F18 was processed further to get to this state. And these were being and that's the lab copy, lab notebook describing the synthesis of FDG, and that's how this FDG was produced in Brookhaven National Lab by this group of people. So, but now they have prepared this FDG, but it has to be tested. It has to be imaged also. So at the time, the closest PET center was in Philadelphia. So FDG need to be transported from the Brookhaven lab to the Philadelphia so that it can be imaged in human. Logistics were pretty interesting. FDG was made in Brookhaven, packed by Health Physics Group, driven to the local nearby airport, put on a small 4-person plane, and flew from Philadelphia airport and driven to the University of Pennsylvania, and where it can be injected. So that's how that's how it goes on. So, and that's the group of people, that's the volunteer, and that's how it all started from production of FDG in Brookhaven National Lab and imaging studies at University of Pennsylvania. So while the initial development of FDG was initially developed for brain imaging, but several other preclinical studies in the late 1970s and early 1980s suggested that this tracer can be also used for imaging the myocardial metabolism and tumor metabolism also. And then by means of this person, Dr. Kurt, he produced a new process of producing FDG through a nucleophilic process through manuscriptly through this process to get to FDG. We'll talk about it when we talk about the production of FDG. So we'll talk about this reaction also. But this guy produced a greatest process of producing FDG with highest yield in a short duration of 50 minutes. So, and this groundbreaking discovery of FDG opened doors to the exploration of a wide range of disease and conditions, including drug addiction, eating disorders, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, Alzheimer's disease, epilepsy, and CAD. And these FDG PET imaging was also very important for imaging for the diagnosis, staging, and treatment monitoring of cancer, because cancer cells are metabolically more active and they take more FDG than the normal cells, and they are being they can be seen as hotspot from surrounding healthy tissue, and that's the advantage of FDG. Also, it has great implications in a wide range of disease, from these group of disease to even cancer diagnosis, staging, and treatment monitoring of cancer. And these are the group of cyclotrons available across the globe for production of FDG, and that's the batteries manufactured by GE is present in BRC Medical Cyclotron Facility in India, which has an photon energy of 16.5. And that's Dr. Ramamurthy, who was the former chairman of BREET and the chief executive. And so FDG was prepared from these cyclotron and was being administered on the first human volunteer, Dr. Ramamurthy. And the first PET scan was performed in India on October 28, 2002. So these are the references which I have used for this video. And thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And thanks for watching.